We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Fred Felleman. Fred Felleman is a local marine consultant who has spent the past 30 years working to conserve the Pacific Northwest's marine environment. He has worked for a variety of local and national marine conservation organizations, as well as with local and tribal governments. He has been involved with numerous projects, including the creation of the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, the stationing of the Nia Bay Response Tug, enhancing Washington State's oil spill prevention and response capabilities, banning naval bombing of the Copalis Wildlife Refuge, listing the southern resident killer whale population under ESA, creating the Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve and Management Plan, and improving cruise ship discharge requirements. Fred, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
My pleasure.
So you've been covering these issues for a long time. Were you surprised by what happened with BP in the Gulf?
Well, surprised by the magnitude, but not by the inadequacy of the response. And right now, the current tally I've seen listed is BP has spent $3.12 billion in response. They've spilled over 200 million gallons of oil. There's been 1,500 birds collected and 447 sea turtles and over 54 mammals, which include a dead sperm whale and lots of dolphins. So it's the fact that they still don't have it capped is a real dilemma. But the failure of the response is somewhat BP's own making because of their lobbying against more strong response requirements. And this hasn't only made the Gulf tremendously vulnerable and impacted, but it has actually impacted the entire country's ability to respond to oil because we have this declaration of a spill of national significance, and we are actively losing our oil spill response capability in Washington State as well as the rest of the country because this equipment is now being pulled out to be brought to the Gulf.
So you've had numerous experiences with BP here in the past. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. I think it's really important after, over 2 months of news coverage, front page stories almost continuously. I think today's paper in the Times was the first day I've seen in 2 months that there wasn't a BP story in it. But I have yet to see a story about BP's operations in Washington State. BP is the largest refinery in Washington State. It's twice as big as the next biggest one. But we have had no attention to what's been going on here in Puget Sound with regards to their operations. And I've been, unfortunately, very much attendant to their operations here. And it's really been very consistent with the shoddy operations we've seen in both Alaska and in Texas and now in the Gulf. I can give you several examples here. My initial experience with them was when they applied to the Army Corps of Engineers back in the late 90s to double their refinery dock. They were going to build another wing on their dock, and they said to the Army Corps of Engineers, like they said to the Minerals Management Service in the Gulf, the likelihood of a spill is so low that we don't have to do an environmental impact statement, and therefore you should just give us this doubling of our refinery capacity without evaluating the impact of an oil spill as associated with doing that. And so I sued the Army Corps and BP and joined the case. And I was then working for a group called Ocean Advocates. And we had several groups from Bellingham join us in this case. Unfortunately, the oral arguments for the case was held within a week of the 9/11 incident. And so when we were at Federal District Court in Seattle, the U.S. Attorney General couldn't even, come to Seattle because, the national airport was closed. And I was seeking an injunction on the operation of this new dock just as we were flying sorties to the Middle East. And BP is, only recently been made attention to the fact that they are the West Coast largest producer of jet fuel for the Department of Defense. In fact, nationally, they're the largest provider of defense fuels. And so the judge sort of said, this is the most uncertain time in the world. They just agreed with whatever BP said. And so, what I always like to say is that, what I lack in talent, I make up for in perseverance. And so I appealed. And, after things settled down a little bit, we prevailed quite completely in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And so BP was then required to do an environmental impact statement and evaluate what doubling their dock would mean for oil spills. Unfortunately, this was done several years ago, and the Army Corps of Engineers has still yet to release the results, and BP has actively lobbied the investigators at George Washington University to modify the results because they weren't happy with the findings, and I think the Army Corps is somewhat complicit by not releasing the data that would be incredibly useful for us to evaluate not just BP's operations, but we're expecting a whole rash of oil spill legislation to come forward post this spill, and without this model that looks at how vessel traffic moves through our waters, we're going to be somewhat hamstrung by our ability to know what's the best thing to do in response, because we haven't gotten this. It was over $1 million study that I required as part of my suit that we just haven't had the benefit of seeing the results. So that's a bit of a challenge.
So what is the hurdle for getting those results out? What are they saying, the reason they can't do it?
Well, the Army Corps of Engineers just doesn't seem to have made enough priority of it, and I've been seeking congressional oversight and intervention to break this study loose. And it's hopefully going to be coming forth shortly, and we're actively seeking, given all this attention to BP right now, that these data are available for the public to benefit from. I have had, I serve on the Puget Sound Harbor Safety Committee for the Makah tribe, who's one of the leaders in oil spill efforts in Washington State, because they live out there at the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, where the Nia Bay tug is now stationed, and they're just trying to we're trying to just get this information out, but I have been able to get some results, and it does seem that the dock is pretty clearly a violation of Senator Magnuson's efforts to prevent federal agencies from granting permits to refineries that would allow them to double their dock or to expand their dock capacities for handling crude oil for other than Washington State consumption. Senator Magnuson, back in the late 70s, was overseeing one of the greatest changes to oil spill risk in Washington State's history. All our refineries are pushed up against the backwaters of the Sound, and because they were located there because they would receive their crude oil by pipeline from Canada, and so the docks initially were built primarily just to shuttle the refined product by barge to the various destinations. Come the late 70s, Valdez, the North Slope of Alaska, came online, and the Spiro Agnew was the deciding vote that the pipeline would not go to Canada, but we can't trust those foreign countries, hostile Canadians, and you step on their toe, they say, excuse me. So the idea that we would then have oil come to Valdez, that means that the tanker traffic would now bring the oil to Puget Sound refineries instead of the pipeline. And so Magnuson said, oh my God, this is like, a whole nother change in risk exposure. So he did a couple of wonderful things. One is he said, no super tankers east of Port Angeles. So the Exxon Valdez was like 188,000 deadweight ton tanker. We don't allow anything bigger than 125,000 deadweight ton tanker to come to our waters. That's still 33 million gallons of oil on board one of those vessels. He also then said we should only be exposed to the risk of a spill proportional to our appetite for oil, which is a bit of a kind of a provincial attitude these days in global trade and all that. But in fact, it was very insightful. They said, look, if you want to expand refinery capacity to serve other markets, he wanted them to offload at Port Angeles and then pipe the oil to the destinations instead of weaving through the San Juan Islands or down to Tacoma. And so that was a major issue. And so, but this case was never tried. So BP bought the Arco refinery up at Cherry Point, and that refinery is the newest refinery, and it was designed initially to put oil over the mountains to the Rocky Mountain markets, to Chicago, basically. And so, Magnuson said, look, he wanted the oil to offload at Port Angeles, and he said, we're not going to allow this to be expanded beyond that. And but in fact, what BP did was clearly in contravention of that intention to, because we're already a net exporter of oil in Washington State. We serve California, and Oregon doesn't even have a refinery. So almost all of Oregon's oil comes from the risk exposure that Washington State has. So it's very important that we, try to enforce the laws that we have, and that's unfortunately required me to, enforce the law via the lawsuit. But we're right now in a situation where until the Army Corps determines what's going on, we don't know what the final punchline is. A couple of things we did learn, though, in the course of doing this. The rationale that BP used for not requiring an EIS, or why they convinced the Corps not to require an EIS, was they said, look, every fuel, this will actually make things safer, they said. Every transfer of oil would be pre-boomed. So this law that we recently put in place for all facilities, but this was a condition that they said would be for all tankers calling on this new dock. And so I was monitoring that operation, and I found out that not only did they not pre-boom after they got the dock built, they actually removed the physical mooring buoy system that would allow pre-booming to occur, because you have to hold the boom off the ship so it gives some room for the oil to move between the ship and the boom. And so, in fact, they used this premise to get away with getting a dock without an EIS, and then they removed the physical infrastructure to actually do it. Because of my lawsuit, they were required to then put it back into place. And then, again, BP's operations are never seeming to be fully up to snuff. And actually, a guy got killed installing the mooring system back in place again, which was really tragic. So now we have this pre-booming requirement, but there's an exception to the rule that said it's only when it's safe and effective. You only have to pre-boom when the sea states are not too rough. And in Alaska, I had the pleasure of serving on I got a ride from the president of Arco Shipping before BP bought them. Jerry Asplund was one of the nation's leaders in safety consciousness, and he had said, "Look, Fred, you're a critic. I'll show you what a good job I do." So I got to sail from Valdez to Cherry Point on the Arco Fairbanks, and so it was really quite a great experience. But the fact of the matter is that we everybody on board that ship was willing to tell me how they had a chance to tell Jerry Asplund a thing or two about, how to do business better. And they were very proud of the fact that they had access to the president of shipping, of Arco Shipping. And, he was such a leader that they fired him because, they didn't want to have anybody that was that far out in front of the rest of the industry. So that was pretty unfortunate, but somewhat telling about the nature of this industry. I'm lost track, though, of what I was just telling you about. This was the reason for that was the operation at the dock is it's a complicated situation where what turns out after 1 year of monitoring how pre-booming occurred throughout Washington State, it turns out that BP at Cherry Point, which is next to the former largest herring bed in the state of Washington. Herring are like the manna of the sea, that everything eats herring, from the Chinook salmon to the killer whales to the seabirds. And they found that the BP was the most likely to take the exemptions to the safe and effective standards. So even the refinery at ConocoPhillips, just down the block a piece at Ferndale, they would boom more often than BP would. So, they say we're going to pre-boom all the transfers, they remove the infrastructure, then they're required to put back the infrastructure, they kill a guy in the process, and then they don't use the infrastructure as often as everybody else does. So this is the kind of slipshod operations that seems to characterize this industry that's beyond pathetic.
And I believe from your recent article in Crosscut, you stated that BP also has been very active in the current 2010 legislation here in the state.
Oh yeah, BP, because they're the largest refinery, they have some of the most at stake. They're also the largest producer of oil in the nation. They are the largest owner in the North Slope of Alaska. They're the largest producer of oil in the Gulf of Mexico. So they have some of the largest influence over, the American Petroleum Institute and a lot of these other, associations that are lobbying on behalf of the interests of the oil industry. But it's a lot of, it's BP's baby in a lot of ways. So they don't just rely on Western States Petroleum Association, WSPA, that's their acronym, to represent their interests in Olympia. They have their own lobbyists in Olympia as well as WSPA lobbyists. And they fought vehemently against the stormwater legislation that was tried to be passed last year, which was going to be funded on the oil industry's back a bit. But this is just, another indication that, it all comes down to the bottom line, even though when they do spill, it's far more expensive to clean up than it is to prevent. They seem to be very much into penny pinching. I call it buck pinching. That's another good acronym for BP.
And the basics of the stormwater legislation was what?
Well, it was to basically create a fund that would allow for retrofitting and other sensible development practices that would have prevented the runoff issues, because there is a lot of oil in runoff. But it was just the oil companies didn't want to have to pay for it.
How else has BP been active in shaping the responses that they do use? For instance, I know in the Gulf they're using a lot of dispersants currently that are causing a lot of problems. Weren't they active in pushing for the use of dispersants over, let's say, skimmers?
Yeah, that's a very, very important point that I bring up in my Crosscut story. But the fact of the matter is, after the Exxon Valdez, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 said, clearly we need to have higher response standards. And like the other provision that's most famous about the Open 90 provision was that the double hulls for oil tankers would all come in place by 2015. Well, originally it was going to be 2010. And in fact, back in Magnuson's days, he was trying to get double hulls, but it took the Exxon Valdez to get a double hull amendment in. But Congress, in its inimical wisdom, said, look, it takes a while to build a ship, so we're going to phase it in over time. Similarly, when the Coast Guard said we need to have more response capability, we won't require it all at once. We'll let it phase in over time. And they envisioned, like, every 5 years, they would increase the capacity by about 25%. And so they did that once, and then BP basically said, well, maybe instead of spending all this money on this equipment that has to stand by and won't be used all that often, we're just going to basically put a big plane in the middle of the country, a C-130, with a dispersant pack on it. And that way, rather than having equipment stationed all around the country, we'll just have this one national resource, and we'll be able to fly to whatever spot within the response standard requirements for dispersant use. And as such, we had far less equipment stockpiled in strategic places around the country, so that, in fact, the default response to any spill of any size is dispersants, because you don't have a full toolkit available to you. So it's one thing we said with the Macaw, it's one thing to have dispersants, but it can't be at the expense of other things. And so, having all the tools in the toolkit available to you is one thing. Having it trade off was another. And Coast Guard, despite the fact that they said it appears that elevating the cap makes sense and that there's recoverable oil and it's justifiable and all that, again, due to the enormous influence of this industry, they were able to dumb it down, and so that we didn't get the response requirements put in place. And this is something that I think Congress should immediately do. And in fact, not Congress, but I think the administration should say, look, we had the studies, we knew it was appropriate to do, we're just going to go and do it. This was time to revisit what was seen as the appropriate activity. And as a result of this failure for BP's planning standards in the Gulf, and they're leading the lobbying effort to dumb down the requirements, this has put the rest of the country at this risk. And now, it's not like we're telling people not to bring cargo into Washington State. Washington State, many people don't realize this. The ports of Seattle and Tacoma is the third largest port complex in the country. LA and New York are the first two. However, there's this country to the north that has a port called Vancouver. Vancouver is the largest port in all of Canada. So if you take the largest port in Canada and you combine it with the third largest port complex in the United States, Straits of Juan de Fuca become an extraordinarily busy water body, one of the busiest in North America. Also, you can see even in this beautiful weather time that we're finally getting here, you can see the Straits of Juan de Fuca is a funnel for wind. So, we were blowing 15, 20 knots yesterday when we had 90-degree weather, and it's in the, finally summertime has arrived, but still it's tough out there. So we don't have gear appropriate to that kind of operating environment, and we don't have stockpiles of equipment sufficient to do that prior to the spill. And now we have that much left. In fact, we were just notified yesterday that one of the big skimmers in Nia Bay even is leaving. And Nia Bay is, one of these real remote locations next to the marine sanctuary that we worked on getting designated that, it's so far removed from an immediate response. We know that unless you contain a spill soon, shortly after it occurred, you're basically just chasing oil up and down the block for TV because you're not really doing it, because you're not really going to get any significant recovery. So this is a tremendously disturbing situation, but somewhat a creation of BP's own making.
So we're pretty much defenseless then, once that skimmer leaves from Nia Bay?
Well, if I wish it was just that. It was the skimmer in Nia Bay. They're talking about pulling the one out of Port Angeles and out of the Columbia River, the even bigger skimmer. We've lost almost all the Navy skimmers and the booms that the Navy has. They pulled the biggest boom out of Prince William Sound even. Here's a sacrilegious situation where they had to suffer the school of hard knocks, and even they are being deprived because because this is called a spill of national significance. We have to cascade these resources in. And BP said, oh yeah, we'll be able to fly, equipment in from London. They said when we were trying to get them to stockpile more equipment on the Washington coast. And we just know that, if you rely on this lagging assets of cascading resources, that you're basically have this large tally at the end of the day of how many skimmers and equipment is on site, but you're really not accomplishing a significant recovery effort.
And as you had pointed out in your Crosscut article also, if an area like the Gulf of Mexico doesn't have the adequate equipment, then that's a real indicator of how we're hurting, nationally.
Right. That's a really remarkable thought that, no place in the United States is there more oil infrastructure than in the Gulf of Mexico. So you have more oil employees, you have more those huge rig tender vessels that were fighting the fire on the rig and all that. Those vessels, they weren't even equipped with skimmers on them. They had all the deck space in the world, but they were just fireboats and rig tenders, but they didn't even bother to equip them with spill response capability. There was a spill about a year ago, and I go to these Coast Guard meetings on a regular basis, and it was in New Orleans where a tug and a barge and a tanker collided right in downtown New Orleans. So here you have, we see this kind of crazy dichotomy of whereas, the fishermen are probably the largest employers in the area, but the real money is in the oil industry. So even though there's less people employed by the oil industry, there's more financial interest there. And so you have all this personnel in the neighborhood, but in fact, they couldn't get enough people even in downtown New Orleans to start cleaning up, so they put a notice up on a Craigslist. And, we were always told you can't go anywhere near an oil spill without HAZWOPER training, and you have to protect yourself and all this stuff. So they go and notify the general public, sign up for your HAZWOPER training, download this button, and you can go and be rubbing rocks for a living. And so the fact of the matter is most of the people that responded to this Craigslist were from Mexico. And so not only did they not have HAZWOPER training, they didn't have green cards. And but they were, diligent workers willing to put up with this horrible stuff that most other people wouldn't. And but when the Coast Guard helicopters flew overhead to direct them to where the slicks were thickest and things like that, they would scatter because they thought it was INS. And this is what the Coast Guard, this is in there, they call these hot washes, the lessons learned, And this was just a year or so prior to the BP spill. So we had plenty of forewarning that we were wholly inadequate in the Gulf and still didn't better prepare. So, you can have all the equipment in the world. If you don't have personnel to run it, that's not going to bode very well for the quality of the response.
So if you were put in charge of fixing things here in the state, and you can expand that to nationally if you want to, but for our dealing with oil spills and the like, what would you do?
I think the single most cost-effective thing to do is to work with the tribal governments in Washington state who are fishermen and use these resident vessels that don't go to Alaska in the summer to fish like the commercial fishermen do. And they know their local waterways. They have their own vessels. And just to equip these guys with appropriate personal protection gear as well as spill response equipment. And they are scattered throughout the Sound and on the coast. And they would immediately be able to respond to a spill in their backyard. And they could cascade within the Sound. If there was a big spill someplace, they could, all motor on down. But there's no way we're going to ever get the number of boats and personnel, on standby all the time, just on the nickel of the oil industry. Although they should just subsidize these guys for training and drilling and equipping them. And especially now that we've been deprived of this equipment. And in fact, tribal governments the federal government has a trust obligation to tribal governments to have fish to fish and resources to be protected that are treaty protected resources. But when they declared this national emergency, tribal governments weren't even consulted whether or not removing this equipment was a violation of their trust obligations. So I'm hoping, and we're going to be going back to D.C. here very soon, to say, hey, look, we have companies like Kwiak Marine in Ballard who are turning out skimmers now for the Gulf, that we want to have them keep busy turning out skimmers and equipment for us. And there's a company in Tacoma that builds boom. They can take our stuff right now, but we want to backfill with modern, appropriate equipment, and in the near term, give the fishermen who have the most at stake ability to protect their own interests. And the folks up in Prince William Sound after the spill created this Regional Citizen Advisory Council that's basically, they say, those who have the most to lose when things go wrong should have a voice in saying how to make things go right. And so we're hoping that the sovereign interests of tribal governments are going to be able to impress upon the federal government to better equip us, which will not only protect their treaty interests, but the entire region will be benefited from that.
You'd also pointed out that we're at a unique point in time in terms of the citizens and Congress in dealing with the oil industry. Can you talk about that real briefly?
Yeah, sure. This is a very reactive industry that the only time we're able to get the oil industry to be regulated is when we have to sort of kick them while they're down. It's an unfortunate reality of this situation. There's a whole bunch of legislation being introduced and stuff. Senator Cantwell has a Coast Guard reauthorization bill that has several really very strong provisions for Washington State in it, preserving our ability to require tug escorts, extending the amount of spill response equipment necessary to go all out the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and that bill will hopefully pass. It's passed the House and the Senate. They're now conferencing the two bills together. Senator Cantwell has yet to pass a Coast Guard reauthorization bill, and we're hoping this was the first time that this will happen. At the same time, there's efforts to create authorization for Puget Sound funding, some $90 million for the future. That would, hopefully some of this would be seen to better prepare ourselves for a spill. And there will be plenty of other legislation coming up for deals with increasing liability limits, increasing the barrel tax, and keeping oil rigs from our coast.
Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you.